Welcome to this lesson in the series on the parables of Jesus. Today we are looking at the parable of the wheat and the weeds, found in Matthew 13 verses 24 through 30, and then beginning in verse 36, Jesus gives an explanation of the parable. Jesus tells this parable in conjunction with the parable of the sower. Both are agricultural parables related to sowing and reaping, or sowing and harvesting. And these parables are also interesting in that Jesus explains both of these parables directly to the disciples. And they are also connected in that Jesus says this is one of the several kingdom parables that are found in Matthew 13, where he says the kingdom of heaven may be compared to. And he talks about a mustard seed, yeast, pearl of great price, treasure in a field, the parable of the sower, the parable of the wheat and the weeds. So these are several back-to-back parables in which Jesus is giving us this understanding of the kingdom of heaven. Now, one important thing to remember is that Jesus doesn't give us every aspect of every part of the kingdom of heaven in each of the parables. So we take each parable and then you kind of put it together. But in this parable of the wheat and the weeds, we're going to talk a little bit about what it is that Jesus is talking about in terms of the kingdom of heaven and how it is that we look at it now. Now, one difference that there is between the parable of the sower and the parable of the wheat and the weeds, or the wheat and the tares, to use an older term, is that in the parable of the sower, they sow the seed and they wait for the harvest. In the parable of the wheat and the tares, or the wheat and the weeds, as we'll see, there is potential action that is discussed about what to take kind of in the meantime, in the time between the sowing and the reaping. And we'll explore in good fashion that part of the parable, probably more extensively that part of the parable as well. What happens in that time between the sowing and the reaping, and how do we respond there, and what might Jesus be saying to us in that aspect, even as he's talking about this kind of ultimate coming of the kingdom of heaven. So let's get right to it, and let's look at Matthew 13 verses 24 through 30. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householders came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The slaves then said to him, Do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No, for in gathering the weeds you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow until the harvest. And at harvest time I will tell the reapers, Collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. If we jump ahead to verse 36, the disciples approached him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. He answered, The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers. And they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen. So let's take a little bit just take a moment to look at kind of agricultural aspects of that day and time, at least as much as we know. It was very different, obviously, in that day and in that location than when we think about agricultural today. As I'm giving this lesson, I live in the Delta, and I've just lived here a few years, but it doesn't take long to see all that is going on around. And right now it is planting season, and so there are huge tractors that are out there planting thousands and thousands and thousands of acres. Even small-scale farmers farm hundreds of acres of land. They have up-to-date herbicides, which they spray on crops to kill the weeds. There are chemicals to suppress the growth of weeds even before they come up, and then the chemicals to kill the weeds that do come up. Well, in these ancient times, there was nothing like that. None of these herbicides and pesticides. There were no modified plants that had modified to be able to resist these other types of blights. Secondly, the land was very scarce and it was very valuable. And the tracts of land that a family farmed were very small because the sowing and the reaping were done by hand. I tried to look in a variety of places to find maybe an average idea of an average plot of land that a family might have, and for the most part it seemed to be somewhere between 3 and 5 acres. There's one family mentioned, there's an account of a family that has 8 acres, but it was farmed by 2 brothers who each supported a family. And so regardless of whether it was more like 3 or 5, or even if that was a little bit of an undercount, the point is that it was very, very small. And any disruption to the crop could have disastrous effects on the family, particularly because the crop also fed the family. They might have gotten a little bit of income from it to take care of things that they couldn't grow or make, but for the most part, it was to feed the family. And in this day and time, people in that part of the world had a subsistence living. The vast majority of the people had a subsistence living, and many of them lived on the edge of hunger and starvation, and one bad crop could literally cause death in a family. So the enemy goes and sows this bad seed in the farmer's field, this farmer that has sowed good seed. And again, the consequences could be great. As the wheat and the weeds begin to grow, the workers can tell that something is not right. So they go to the farmer, and the farmer then is faced with this dilemma when it's clear that bad seed has been sown. The weeds are there. And the problem is that in this day and time agriculturally, and I just encourage you to pause and go look up a picture of the wheat and the weeds. When in the early stages, it is almost impossible to tell. You really just cannot tell the difference. And so the danger then is that in trying to be proactive and pull up these weeds, then the problem is that they could get the wheat. That's why they would wait till the harvest time to separate the weeds from the wheat. So the workers think they can tell the difference enough to give it a try. They want to go yank out the weeds right away. But remember, again, every grain was important. And this act of sowing the bad seed is clearly not a mistake. It is something evil done to impact not only a family's economic situation, but potentially even their ability to feed their family. So again, this is an evil. It's not just an act of mischief. This is an act of evil perpetrated against another person. Well, one of the things that would be pretty obvious, though, is that weeds aren't good things either. They take away from the good wheat, don't they? They take away nutrients from the good wheat. And it could be argued that it's worth the risk to remove the weeds, to remove the bad seed, even though some good wheat may be sacrificed as well. But the farmer who sowed the good seed is the one who decides what to do. And he says that it's too difficult, that in doing this you are going to pull up the good wheat. And so wait until the harvest time when you can tell what is wheat and what is weed. Well, it doesn't take a lot of imagination. And Jesus again gives us an explanation of this parable to see the overall message of the parable. I want to look at it a little more in depth, though. So part of the trouble or part of the challenge, I guess, is that when we're looking at this parable, in some ways we're kind of looking at it on 2 different tracks. One in a more temporal understanding of our day and time, and one in that ultimate understanding when Jesus is talking about the kingdom of heaven and what will happen in those end times when God comes and judges the earth, when the kingdom of heaven is fully manifest on earth as it already is in heaven. And in that time, Jesus is very clear, and he gives us full explanation about what that is and even who that is in the parable. He tells us who is wheat and who is weed, who will do the harvesting, and who it is that makes the judgment in that time to separate the wheat from the weeds. He tells us that the weeds will be thrown away and burned in everlasting fire, and that the righteous will shine, the wheat will shine. But then there's this other aspect, again, that's particular to the wheat and the weeds, that's not to the sower, about what we do in the meantime as we wait for that time to come. Because in the parable of the sower, Jesus jumps from sowing to the harvest. But what do we look at in this question then, as we are looking at the fact that weeds are growing, but the full harvest has not come? The question then is how are we to respond in our world today to the weeds, to the evil that we see being sown around us? Because it's clear, isn't it? And it should be abundantly clear to anybody who pays attention that enemies of God are at work in this world. If you listen to the parable on the empty house, I talked a little more extensively in that about how there are those forces of evil that are directly opposed to God, that are actively working against God, causing great evil and great harm in this world today. And in this parable, Jesus doesn't state it directly, but we know that agriculturally, presence of the weeds among the wheat affects the wheat as well. The weeds steal nutrients. The weeds steal good things from the wheat. It's not a good thing that weeds exist among the wheat. The desire is for the weed, for the evil to be removed. And in one sense, we can also understand this temptation that the workers have to risk pulling the weeds out in their zeal and desire to do what is right and to help the wheat. The problem, though, is that we are not yet at the harvest time. And it's harder to tell, even when we think we know, it's harder to tell sometimes what is good and what is evil. Some things pretty clear, but it's much more difficult and challenging than we often think. Many times evil comes packaged in an attractive manner. It becomes pretending something to be good. Part of the difficulty of evil is that the forces of evil are deceptive. They know where you and I are the weakest. They attack us at that point. So we are already inclined to overlook some of the evil that is present in our world because the temptation and how it's packaged is attractive in the first place. We're already inclined as human beings to try to rationalize and justify the decisions we make, even when we may know in our heart that they're wrong. And while it's the case that evil and good are as different as weeds and wheat, distinguishing that in our world is much harder at a deeper level than it seems to us sometimes on the surface. We do not have the wisdom and the perspective that God has to make that determination. And in that desire to get rid of harmful weeds around us, the challenge is, and the warning is that we can do damage to the good wheat. And again, we don't have to look too far to see where this has happened. I bet you know people who have been harmed by those who thought they were doing good or trying to do good things, but they caused great harm in the process. I could not count the number of people I've encountered in my ministry who've been harmed by God-fearing Christian folk who thought that they were doing some good, who thought they were standing up for what was right, who thought that they were taking a stand for Christ and would tell me that. But in reality, were causing great harm in the midst of it. I have a friend who many years ago had whose daughter had a child out of wedlock. The church that they attended kicked out the daughter and the entire family because of this sin. They kicked out the daughter because of what she had done. They kicked out the mother because they saw that she clearly had not been a proper influence upon her child. There was no understanding. There was no mercy. There was no support. There was no Hey, you made a mistake, but we still love you. This, in spite of the fact that the family had been very active and faithful over the years, they had demonstrated very clearly the type of people they were, the depth of their faith. One big mistake, and they were out. And it was all justified by the people of that church as them standing up and taking a stand for Christ and opposing evil in this world. Now, the friend ended up eventually going to another church, overcoming that hurt and being active. The daughter never did, and that was many years ago at this point. And the daughter has never been back. Just last week, there was a service technician who came to a house. My wife and I own a house in another town, and he came to look at something at the house. And I mentioned that I was a minister. And when I mentioned I was a minister, he said, "Well, good, because I have a lot of questions." And we started talking about, and I was working on this lesson at that time, and so it was kind of in my mind too. And he was talking about what is right and what is wrong and how we determine what was right. He had attended a church and had quit going to this church because this church removed a friend of his from a position of leadership because the friend decided to grow a beard. And they determined that was not something that he was not living according to the standards of Christ, that he was not living up to his responsibilities, and so they removed him from a position of leadership. He was a Sunday school teacher, and they told him he could no longer teach Sunday school because he had wanted to grow a beard. Now, on one level, of course, these things seem extreme, and that one certainly is. But they are just a few of literally dozens, if not over 100 examples I could give you of people who were good seed, who were God-fearing, good Christian people, but in their zeal for perfection for others, something that they clearly did not have either, they determined that this person in that situation was a weed and must be removed or must be dealt with in that manner. The desire in their mind was to stand up for what they saw as righteous behavior, but in actuality, they caused great harm to those people and their families. At the in-person Bible study time when we had this lesson, someone asked, "So do we just live and let live then? Do we just not pay attention to anything going on around us?" And I don't think it's that either. But I do think what Jesus is getting at is how we deal with these imperfections, how we acknowledge them in our own lives and in the church, how we deal with the imperfections of others, and the way that we respond in those situations where there is failing, where there are mistakes, where there's bad that has been done. Because how we respond about those things says a lot about who we are as well. It says something about our own humility in acknowledging that there are weedy parts of ourselves, and that when it comes again to that larger message of God's kingdom, to acknowledge that God can see what we cannot see and that God knows what we cannot know, because we don't know the motives of others. Sometimes what looks to us to be something wrong, God is using for a good. I know in my own ministry that I have made decisions and taken actions over the course of time that some people got very mad at, and they appeared to be erroneous. I was accused at one place of ruining the church, and I was personally responsible for the destruction for what they perceived as destruction of the church, even though the church was growing and so much other was going on. And new people were coming to Christ, new people were coming to the church. This person was convinced that I was destroying that church because of some decisions that I'd made and actions that I had taken and some things that I had said. But I had information that that person didn't have. They could only see that person in the group that he kind of represented could only see a sliver of the actual situation. And that sliver that they could see did not include an understanding of what I was trying to accomplish. Those of us with children, whether our children are at home or now grown, know that there are times when as parents we made certain decisions and our children didn't understand. It seemed to them to be flat out wrong that we had this perspective that they could not see. And even when our children are grown, there might be decisions that our children make that seem to be erroneous to us. And we can't understand because they know more about that situation than we do. But we think we know what is best, and so we try to go and determine that for someone else. Well, if we know that we have experienced those situations in our own lives where there were people who did not understand, and they thought we were wrong, or they thought we were not taking action, or they thought we were being lazy or not caring, how more is it the case on an infinite level that God can see what we cannot see, and God knows what we cannot know. God has a perspective and can see a situation that includes the entire universe, all of creation, past, present, and future, because past, present, and future means nothing to God. That God can see this eternal perspective that we cannot see. How much more then should we trust God to bring about what is right and good and just? How much more does it require humility and patience on our part to trust that God's justice will be done according to God's will and according to God's timing? You see, in our desire, sometimes we want to jump ahead of God and fix the problem automatically based on the limited information that we can see. But Jesus reminds us in this parable and in several other places that only God is the perfect judge. Only God can judge the condition of somebody's soul, can judge that situation in its fullness. And in our desire and in our zeal to do what is right, to try to protect the wheat, the problem is, and to pull out the weeds, the problem is that too often we pull out the good wheat as well. In a book entitled Sermons from the Parables, Reverend Clovis Chappell puts it this way about the dangers of tare pulling, of pulling of the weeds. Assuming that the puller of the tares is himself wheat, this desire to pull the wheat endangers him. No man, no matter however good he may be at the beginning, can set himself up as the judge of his brother without desperate hurt to his own soul. The church or individual that sets out in such a critical manner to compel others to conform to their standards in every particular will gravitate towards hardness and harshness and unbrotherliness as naturally as night follows day. I think he puts that so well, and you may even want to repeat that, back up a bit and listen to that again. It's this presumption, you see, that we have, that we know what's weeds and we know what's wheat, even out of that desire. I think, and it's my feeling and belief and my practice throughout my ministry, as I look at the overall tenor of Scripture, I look at how Jesus responded, that I think what Jesus is saying in the midst of this is put the emphasis on the wheat. Live your life as Christ calls you to live. Live close to the Lord. Be the best wheat that you can be. Be that good wheat that God has sown, and let God take care of separating the wheat from the weeds. Let the Lord take care of those judgments. Trust in God's wisdom. Trust in God's timetable, not your own. Again, this waiting requires patience and humility, and it's something many of us, and I confess that I struggle with daily. Patience, by the way, is not the same thing as acceptance. Patience means trusting in God, having the conviction that God will deal with evil in His way and in His time, and that God can make that determination far better than we can. And it's remembering, having patience, and remembering that through Jesus Christ, God conquered the forces of evil. So don't try to force the hand of God. The end of the devil, the end of evil is assured. We are told that. We are told what God will one day do. And God has been patient with us, by the way, as well. We are called then to be patient with others, to allow God to work His purposes out in this world, in our lives and in the lives of others. The call, I think, that we have in the meantime is to live that gospel message and to proclaim it in a positive manner that calls us to live close to Christ each and every day in motive and in deed. We start by seeking and working to replace the evil in our lives with the goodness of Christ, letting that love of Christ shine through in our hearts and in our lives, trusting God as that ultimate and perfect judge, knowing that it is not our place to try to circumvent the timetable or the purposes of God. The message is wait until the harvest. Trust in God, let God be the judge. Jesus assures us that in the fullness of the kingdom of heaven, evil will get its just due. But God is the one who will make that determination. Our call is to trust in Him, to be patient, and to be the best wheat we can be. There's a popular hymn that is sung around Thanksgiving, and it's titled, "Come, Ye Thankful People, Come." It's an agricultural hymn, and it talks about reaping, and it talks about the harvest, about the growing and the harvest. But really it speaks of final things. It talks about everything being gathered in, and so it's a popular Thanksgiving theme. But it talks about, too, that ultimate harvest time. Here's a couple of verses of it. All the world is God's own field, fruit unto His praise to yield, wheat and tares together sown, unto joy or sorrow grown. First the blade and then the ear, then the full corn shall appear. Lord of harvest, grant that we wholesome grain and pure may be. For the Lord our God shall come and shall take His harvest home. From His field shall in that day all offenses purge away. Give His angels charge at last in the fire the tares to cast, but the fruitful ears to store in His garner evermore. So as we conclude this lesson, as we remember that enemies of God are at work in this world, as we remember that as imperfect people we live in an imperfect world where there is weed as well as wheat, as we remember that we are to practice patience, as we remember to put the emphasis on growing the wheat and not trusting God with the tares, as we remember to leave the judgment of God, leave the judging in this world to the perfect perspective, timing, and will of God. When we remember these things and we live them out, then we can also sing and live out the final verse, the words of the final verse of this hymn. Even so, Lord, quickly come. Bring Thy final harvest home. Gather Thou Thy people in, free from sorrow, free from sin. There forever purified, in Thy presence to abide. Come, with all Thine angels come, raise the glorious harvest home. I thank you for joining me in the lesson today, and if you have feedback, I invite you to put that here in the comments section for any discussion or feedback or thoughts that you might have. I thank you for taking the time to listen, and I hope that you have a wonderful day in the Lord as you go to be that good wheat living for Christ in this world today. Thank you, and have a great day.